Okay, let's unpack this. You know that feeling, right? That first sip in the morning, or maybe the afternoon pick-me-up, the late night study fuel. Caffeine is just, well, it's everywhere.
It really is. It
Yeah.
feels so simple on the surface. You drink coffee, you feel more awake. But like when you dig into it and looking at this stack of sources you've shared, it's clear the science behind that feeling is incredibly complex.
Yeah, complex is the word. It touches everything, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Brain chemistry, how our bodies process things, even our biological clocks, and long-term health, too.
Absolutely. Everything's connected.
Exactly. So we've got this fascinating pile of stuff from your research papers, articles, some notes, even some interesting visuals, all focused on caffeine.
And our goal here really is to sort of unpack all of that, pull out the key insights, the main takeaways, and give you a clear, comprehensive picture of what caffeine actually does.
Like a shortcut through the science behind your daily cup or, whatever your caffeine source is.
Precisely. Think of it that way.
So we're going to explore how it hits cognitive function, physical performance, dig into the psychological side like dependence.
The mood effects, anxiety.
Right, and how your body actually handles it, the metabolism. Then there are the links to long-term health, and maybe especially how it messes with or interacts with sleep and our daily rhythms.
It's definitely a deep dive.
Yeah.
Probably the world's most popular psychoactive substance, right?
It has to be. Okay, so let's start where most people feel it first, I guess, the mind. Are we actually getting a real mental edge from caffeine? What do these sources say about cognitive performance?
Well, the first thing, and this comes through loud and clear from pretty much all the sources, is the basic benefit. Alertness and vigilance. That's solid.
Okay, so feeling more awake, more watchful.
Exactly. Caffeine is a well-established stimulant. It reliably improves your ability to stay awake, pay attention, and stay focused. The data backs that up consistently.
Right. I saw that mentioned across a few papers. Increased alertness, better vigilance, focus. And it really shows up in studies where people are sleep deprived, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. That's where it's particularly noticeable.
Yeah.
When you're tired, caffeine helps counteract that natural slump. It can significantly improve things like your reaction time, how quickly you spot things visually. Basically helps you perform closer to how you would if you're fully rested.
So it kind of helps override fatigue, at least temporarily.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
The temporary override button when your system's running low on sleep.
But does it make you, smarter? The sources get into problem solving and reasoning. Is there a boost there, or is it less about creativity?
Yeah, that distinction seems pretty clear in the material.
Okay.
One study we looked at specifically pointed out that while caffeine can boost your ability to solve problems, think logically, it doesn't seem to enhance creativity.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so it helps you perform certain thinking tasks maybe more efficiently, especially ones needing sustained attention or quick processing. Things like finding numbers quickly in a search task or simple reaction time tests, those see improvement.
Okay.
And another paper specifically mentioned better performance on a verbal reasoning task.
So it's maybe less about giving you brand new thinking skills and more about sharpening what you've got, especially if you're tired or under pressure.
I think that's a really good way to frame it, yeah.
Yeah.
It helps you use your existing cognitive tools more effectively, especially when things are challenging, like fatigue or tasks needing a lot of effort.
Okay. Now, memory. That's another big one the sources cover. And it sounds like the relationship there is, well, it's complicated, not just a simple memory boost.
Definitely not simple. The effects on memory are quite nuanced. One finding that really jumped out from the material was about explicit memory.
Explicit memory. That's like remembering facts, events, things you consciously recall.
Exactly. And the research showed a pretty striking improvement in explicit memory performance. But here's the kicker. It was particularly noticeable for young adults during their non-optimal time of day.
Non-optimal time, you mean like early morning?
Yeah.
Before their brain has fully woken up naturally.
Precisely. Think about students facing early morning exams or classes. One study showed that caffeine significantly improved their ability to recall information on a specific memory test compared to a placebo group. It seems to help bridge that gap when your natural alertness level is low.
Okay. So the classic need coffee to function in the morning thing, there's actually specific evidence for that, at least for remembering facts.
There is, for explicit memory, yes, but it's also quite specific. The same research found that implicit memory didn't seem to change with caffeine.
Implicit, like skills, habits, things you remember without consciously thinking about it.
Yeah, like word stem completion priming, where seeing a word earlier makes you more likely to complete a fragment with that word later. Caffeine didn't seem to touch that. This suggests it's not just general arousal making everything stick better. It might be more targeted towards consciously retrieving information.
That makes sense. And working memory, your mental scratch pad, basically. Holding info temporarily. How does caffeine affect that?
Working memory is influenced too. The sources mention research looking at its effects on memory span, like how many digits you can remember, and also your ability to resist distractions while you're trying to hold information in mind.
Okay.
And there was an fMRI study mentioned looking at brain activity. It indicates caffeine actually changes the patterns of activation in brain areas involved in working memory. So it's getting down to the neural level.
It's changing how the brain is actually working, not just the final output.
Right. It's affecting the underlying mechanisms.
And speaking of those brain processes, attentional control comes up too. It sounds like caffeine affects the brain's attention networks, but whether it helps or hurts kind of depends on the situation.
That's a really key point. It modulates those attentional networks, but the outcome, improved performance, or maybe even impaired performance, can depend a lot on the specific task you're doing, and maybe even you as an individual.
Okay.
One source offered a really interesting angle here. It suggested caffeine primarily improves response selection.
Response selection. Can you break that down a bit?
Sure. Think of it as correctly choosing the right action or response based on what you're seeing or deciding. The research saw this in tasks like the Stroop test, where you have to say the color of the ink, not the word itself.
Right, yeah. Tricky one.
Yeah. Caffeine seemed to improve accuracy there, and also on choice reaction time tasks, where you have to link a specific signal to the right button press. The argument in that source was that it's not necessarily making your selective attention better, like filtering out distractions better or stopping your mind from wandering generally. It's more about helping you link the input to the correct output more efficiently and accurately.
That's a subtle but important difference. It's helping your brain connect perception to the right action.
Exactly. And this connects to another crucial point raised in the sources about studying caffeine's immediate effects, the acute effects.
Okay, what's the issue there?
It's the need for a proper withdrawal period before you test someone. If participants only stop caffeine for, say, a day or two, any boost you see might just be them getting over mild withdrawal symptoms. It might not be a true benefit above their normal baseline.
So they feel better just because they're not feeling slightly groggy from withdrawal anymore.
Precisely. The studies really emphasize this. To see the actual acute effects of caffeine as a stimulant, separate from just withdrawal relief, you need people to abstain for longer, ideally a full week, before you run the tests.
That makes complete sense. You need a clean slate, a true baseline to measure against. Otherwise, you're just measuring getting back to zero.
It really highlights how tricky it is to study something people consume so regularly.
Definitely. And diving even deeper, the sources get into actual brain activity. What does caffeine do to our brainwaves?
Yeah, they mentioned studies using EEG electroencephalography, which measures the brain's electrical chatter. These show caffeine influences various brainwave frequencies, delta, theta, alpha, sigma, beta waves.
Can you give us a super quick reminder of what those generally mean, like different brain gears?
Sort of, yeah. Delta waves are the slowest, dominant in deep sleep. Theta is a bit faster, linked to drowsiness, meditation, sometimes creativity. Alpha waves are when you're awake but relaxed, maybe daydreaming. Beta waves are faster, associated with active thinking, concentration. And sigma includes sleep spindles, important for memory consolidation during sleep. Caffeine seems to shift the activity levels and balance between these different states.
Okay. And there were some really intriguing findings about brain complexity and something called criticality during sleep itself.
Yeah.
That sounds weird.
It was surprising, wasn't it? Studies indicate caffeine can actually increase the complexity of brain signals and push brain activity towards what scientists call a critical state, especially during non-REM sleep. And this effect might even depend on age during REM sleep.
A critical state during sleep, what does that even mean? Why would you want complexity then?
So in neuroscience, a critical state is like a system balanced right on the edge between being too ordered and too chaotic. It's often thought to be optimal for processing information, being adaptable, handling complexity. Think of it like the sweet spot for computational power.
Okay.
The sources don't fully spell out the implications, but finding that caffeine shifts the sleeping brain towards this state, it raises fascinating questions. Is it subtly altering how the brain consolidates memories overnight? Or maybe how it prepares for waking up? It's not fully understood, but it's happening.
Wow. So it's not just stopping you from sleeping, it might be changing the quality or the nature of the brain's activity while you're asleep.
That seems to be the implication. It shows how deeply it interacts with brain function. And conversely, the sources note that caffeine withdrawal does the opposite. In a way, it's linked to an increase in those slower theta waves during sleep.
The drowsy waves.
Right. And that increase in theta during sleep correlates with people reporting decreased concentration and more drowsiness when they're awake during withdrawal.
Which loops right back to that withdrawal reversal idea we talked about.
Exactly. Maybe some of that morning coffee boost isn't adding something new, but partly just counteracting the extra theta activity and the associated grogginess caused by overnight withdrawal.
Man, it's so much more tangled than just caffeine wakes you up. It's messing with brain states, sleep structure, electrical patterns, complex stuff.
It really, really is.
Yeah.
Far more intricate than just feeling alert.
Okay, let's pivot a bit. Beyond the mind, caffeine clearly hits our physical performance too. Let's get into that.
It certainly does. The sources we look through note improvements in tasks that need fine motor control.
Fine motor control, like what specifically?
Things like tapping speed, how fast you can tap your finger, and also hand steadiness. Some of the visual data included in the sources actually showed this quite clearly. A nice graph illustrating a dose-dependent improvement, more caffeine, led to better hand steadiness and faster tapping.
Okay, so for precise movements, caffeine can give a measurable boost. That kind of makes sense, right? Stimulant should affect muscle control, reactions.
It does seem to sharpen that connection for certain tasks, yeah. The brain telling the muscles what to do more precisely or quickly.
But how does our body actually, process this stuff once we drink it? Let's quickly look at the metabolism part from the sources.
Right, so once you consume caffeine, it gets absorbed pretty quickly from your gut, mostly the small intestine. It usually hits peak levels in your bloodstream within, say, 30 to 60 minutes for most people.
Although food can slow that down.
Yeah, having food in your stomach can delay absorption, maybe anywhere from 15 minutes up to 2 hours to reach peak levels.
And once it's in the blood, it gets around.
Oh yeah, it travels very widely. It's good at getting into pretty much all body tissues, and it crosses important barriers, the blood-brain barrier, obviously, which is how it affects your brain. Also, the blood-placenta barrier, so it reaches a fetus.
Okay.
And even the blood-testis barrier, so it's quite pervasive systemically.
So where does the actual breakdown happen? Where does the body deal with it?
Your liver is the main processing plant for caffeine. There's a key enzyme called cytochrome P450-1A2, or just CYP1A2 for short. It does about 95% of the initial breakdown work.
CYP1A2. Got it. Like the main caffeine handler enzyme.
Pretty much. Think of it that way. Other enzymes chip in too, like xanthine oxidase and A2, but CYP1A2 is the star player determining how fast caffeine gets cleared. The main process is called demethylation, basically snipping off little chemical bits called methyl groups from the caffeine molecule.
And how fast that enzyme works, that varies a lot between people, right? That explains a lot.
Hugely. This is absolutely crucial. It's a major reason why one person might feel a coffee for just a couple of hours, and someone else feels jittery half the day from the same amount. There's significant variation in how efficiently people absorb it, and especially how quickly their CYP1A2 enzyme metabolizes it. This directly impacts caffeine's half-life, how long it takes for half of it to leave your system, which the sources say can range anywhere from 2 hours to maybe 12 hours.
Wow, 2 to 12 hours is a massive range. No wonder responses are so different. And it's not just broken down into like inert stuff, is it? It turns into other chemicals that are also active.
That's a really, really important point that sources emphasize. Caffeine gets broken down mainly into other compounds that are themselves biologically active. The main one is paraxanthine, that accounts for something like 84% of the breakdown products.
Paraxanthine, okay.
Then you also get theobromine, which is about 12%, and theophylline, about 4%. You might know theobromine from chocolate.
Right. And paraxanthine is the big one here.
Yeah, because it's the most abundant, and it's not just hanging around, it's active too. It has effects similar to caffeine, maybe slightly different profile sometimes. And the sources note something interesting. Paraxanthine tends to accumulate in your system if you consume caffeine regularly. Its levels drop more slowly than caffeine itself.
So it builds up.
It can, yeah. And because it accumulates and clears more slowly, paraxanthine likely contributes quite a bit to the overall duration and maybe the feel of caffeine's effects, especially if you drink a lot or drink it frequently. Very little of the original caffeine molecule, maybe only 0.5% to 2%, actually gets peed out unchanged. Most of it gets processed into these active metabolites first.
So that caffeine buzz isn't just caffeine. It's caffeine plus paraxanthine and a bit of the others too. It's a cocktail.
It really is a cocktail of active compounds working in your system. The story is definitely richer than just the initial caffeine hit.
Okay, moving on to how it makes us feel psychologically, beyond just alert. The sources talk about that whole feel good, feel bad spectrum.
Yeah, caffeine definitely has a complex, dose-dependent relationship with mood and anxiety. At higher doses, some people might experience a mild sense of euphoria.
Euphoria, like feeling really good.
Well, mild euphoria. The sources are careful to point out it's not the intense high you'd get from something like amphetamines or cocaine. There aren't the same repetitive behaviors or risk of psychosis. It's more subtle, maybe just feeling in good spirits, a gentle lift for some people.
Okay. And then there's the flip side, anxiety. A lot of people report that.
Oh yeah, that's definitely on the feel-bad side for some. Taking a dose of caffeine, especially if you haven't had any for a while, can significantly increase self-reported anxiety.
Especially if you're not used to it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It seems more pronounced in people who don't consume caffeine regularly. They're more sensitive. And also, interestingly, in people with a specific genetic marker.
Wait, a gene linked to caffeine anxiety? That sounds specific.
It is. One source highlighted a connection to people with the ADORA A2A RS5751876 TT genotype. ADORA A2A is a gene for an adenosine receptor. Remember, caffeine works by blocking adenosine. This specific gene variant seems to affect how sensitive those receptors are, and people with the TT version seem more likely to feel anxious from caffeine.
Wow. That really drives home the individual biology factor, doesn't it? Down to specific genes.
It absolutely underscores that variability. And beyond just the immediate effect, studies looked at regular weekly caffeine intake. One focused on university students found links between higher weekly caffeine, especially from energy drinks, cola, coffee, and higher self-reported stress, anxiety, and depression.
And particularly in females in that study.
Yes, that association was stronger for females in that particular group.
Okay. Energy drinks seem to be a recurring theme here. We should circle back to those.
Definitely. So clinicians are advised, based on this kind of info, to consider caffeine as a potential cause or trigger for anxiety, especially if someone already has anxiety disorder.
Makes sense.
But the sources also add context. The doses linked to really severe anxiety effects are usually quite high, like 1 to 2 grams a day. That's maybe 10 to 20 cups of coffee, way more than most people drink. And there's also a suggestion that people who naturally get anxious or jittery from caffeine might just avoid it or limit their intake, sort of a built-in self-regulation for many.
Right. So the potential is there, especially at high doses or if you're genetically prone, but maybe many people naturally steer clear if it makes them feel bad.
That seems to be the implication for the general population, yes. Though clinicians need to be aware for specific cases.
Okay. Now, beyond the negative stuff like anxiety, did the sources look at caffeine and positive feelings, like happiness or optimism?
Yes, there was some research exploring that, how coffee consumption relates to those positive states over time.
And what did they find? Anything interesting?
Well, one study, a longitudinal one focusing just on women, found that heavy coffee consumption, they defined that as 4 or more cups a day, was linked to a slightly lower chance of staying really happy over a 10-year period.
Huh. So heavy use might make sustained high happiness a bit less likely. Okay. What about optimism?
This is where it gets interesting and a bit counterintuitive. In the same study, moderate coffee drinking 1 to 3 cups a day was associated with a slightly higher chance of sustaining high levels of optimism over that same decade.
Okay, wait. So moderate coffee might help sustain optimism, but heavy coffee might slightly hinder sustaining happiness. That's specific.
It is specific based on this one study in women. And these links seem separate from depression levels. It wasn't just that coffee was fighting off depression. The study apparently looked at other caffeine sources too, but the sources we have really only detailed the coffee findings for happiness and optimism.
Man, it's just such a mixed bag, isn't it? A little lift for some, anxiety for others, these subtle long-term links to optimism or happiness depending on how much you drink.
It absolutely hammers home that point. Dose, individual response, even the source of the caffeine all seem to matter a lot for the psychological effects.
Which leads us perfectly into the next bit. Dependence and withdrawal. Let's talk about the grip, as the outline puts it.
Yeah, and it's crucial to say it up front, as the sources do. Caffeine is classified as a psychoactive drug, and it can lead to dependence.
It's even formally recognized in the DSM-5, the big diagnostic manual.
It is. The DSM-5 includes specific criteria for both caffeine intoxication, having too much at once, and caffeine withdrawal, the effects of stopping. And importantly, it now also recognizes caffeine use disorder.
Caffeine use disorder. Okay, what does that actually mean, according to the criteria mentioned?
It's defined as a problematic pattern of caffeine use happening over at least 12 months, causing significant problems or distress. To get the diagnosis, you have to meet a certain number of specific criteria. And like other substance use disorders, it's rated on severity, mild, moderate, or severe, depending on how many criteria you meet.
What are some of those key criteria?
Things like using more caffeine or using it for longer than you intended to, trying to cut down or control your use but not being able to, spending a lot of time getting caffeine, using it, or recovering from its effects, and experiencing craving.
Craving. That's a big one we associate with things like nicotine or other drugs.
Exactly. And the sources describe caffeine cravings similarly, an intense desire or urge for it. It can feel compulsive sometimes. It can be triggered by internal things like feeling tired or stressed, or external cues walking past your favorite coffee shop, the smell of brewing coffee. It can have both physical and psychological roots.
And avoiding withdrawal symptoms, that seems like a huge reason people keep using it, even if they maybe want to cut back.
Oh, absolutely. Withdrawal is a major factor driving continued regular use. The symptoms are well documented in the sources and pretty common for regular users who suddenly stop or drastically reduce their intake.
What kind of symptoms are we talking about? The common ones.
The list is pretty classic. Headache is a big one. Irritability, feeling anxious, drowsiness, fatigue, sometimes muscle pain or stiffness, finding it hard to concentrate, decreased alertness, and even impaired psychomotor performance, basically, being a bit clumsy or slow reacting.
And how quickly do those hit? And how long do they last?
They can start pretty fast, often within 12 to 24 hours after your last dose.
Yeah.
And they can stick around for a while, the sources say up to 7 to 10 days.
Wow, up to 10 days. That's longer than I might have guessed for caffeine.
It can be quite persistent for some people. One source specifically mentioned the headache is likely due to increased blood flow in the brain. Caffeine usually constricts those vessels a bit by blocking adenosine. So when you take the caffeine away, the vessels relax and widen, leading to that rebound headache.
Ah, okay.
And remember those theta waves. We saw withdrawal increases theta waves during sleep, which then links to feeling drowsier and having trouble concentrating when you're awake.
Right. Connecting back to the withdrawal reversal hypothesis again.
Exactly. The idea that maybe some of caffeine's benefits are just bringing you back to normal by alleviating those withdrawal effects, the drowsiness, fatigue, focus issues that set in even overnight. That's why those studies need that week-long washout period to really isolate the true stimulant effects beyond just withdrawal relief.
Yeah, that visual source showing everyone slumped over the broken coffee maker really captures that feeling, doesn't it? Mass withdrawal.
It's a very relatable image for many, I suspect.
So dependence is real, withdrawal is real, they're formally recognized. But is caffeine addiction seen as being on the same level as addiction to, say, alcohol or opioids by clinicians?
That's where the sources mention there's still some debate. Is caffeine use disorder as clinically significant as other substance use disorders? Part of the hesitation cited is that truly compulsive use that severely messes up multiple areas of someone's life. That's not documented nearly as much for caffeine as for things like alcohol or cocaine.
Okay.
Caffeine use disorder doesn't usually wreck daily functioning in the same way unless maybe someone is consuming absolutely massive toxic amounts. The sources also point out that the DSM-5 criteria were originally developed largely with intoxicating drugs in mind, so applying them perfectly to caffeine, which acts differently and isn't typically intoxicating at normal doses, is a bit tricky.
Although it can interact with other drugs.
Yes. The sources do suggest it might interact with other substances people abuse. It could potentially make other drugs feel more rewarding, or maybe even ease withdrawal symptoms from other substances. But more research is needed there.
And just studying caffeine dependence itself is hard.
Definitely. It's challenging because the caffeine content in products varies so wildly. Like we said, a cup of coffee can mean very different doses. Plus, people often use caffeine alongside other things like nicotine or alcohol, which makes it hard to isolate caffeine's specific role in studies.
Okay, so summing that up, recognized dependence, real withdrawal included in the DSM-5, but its overall clinical significance compared to harder drugs is still kind of an ongoing discussion.
That feels like a fair summary of the nuances presented in the sources, yeah.
All right, let's shift gears now. Section 5, caffeine and your body, beyond the brain, beyond mood. How does it affect our physical health? Let's start with the heart and cardiovascular system.
Okay. The sources make it clear that caffeine's effects on the heart and blood vessels are pretty complex, not simple at all.
What are some of the main things it does?
Well, taking caffeine acutely, meaning after not having had any for a bit, tends to kick up your sympathetic nervous system activity.
That's the fight or flight system again.
Exactly. Get you revved up. This activation leads to an increase in peripheral blood pressure, the pressure in your arteries. This jump is especially noticeable in people who don't usually consume caffeine. They might see a significant temporary rise.
What about regular drinkers? Do they get used to that?
Interestingly, yes and no. The sources say habitual drinkers often develop tolerance to the blood pressure effect, so their pressure might not spike as much with their usual dose. However, they might still show that increased sympathetic nerve activity.
Huh. So the body adapts the blood pressure response, but the underlying nervous system might still be getting that go signal.
That's what some research suggests for regular users, yeah. And caffeine also does contradictory things to blood vessels directly. On one hand, it can cause vasoconstriction, narrowing of the vessels. It does this by blocking adenosine receptors, because adenosine normally tells vessels to relax.
Okay, blocks the relax signal so they tighten.
Right. But on the other hand, caffeine can also cause vasodilation, widening of vessels by stimulating the production of nitric oxide in the endothelium, the lining of the vessels. Nitric oxide is a key signal for vessels to relax.
So it's telling vessels to narrow and widen at the same time. How does that work out?
It's like a biological tug of war. The overall effect probably depends on the dose, which mechanism wins out in a particular tissue, and individual factors. But here's a key point. At typical everyday doses, the sources indicate caffeine seems to have limited impact on serious heart rhythm problems, like ventricular arrhythmias.
Even though it revs up the nervous system.
Apparently so. It also doesn't seem to significantly increase things like extra heartbeats, what they call cardiac ectopi, even people considered high risk or those who've had a heart attack. This is despite the fact that caffeine does increase adrenaline levels.
That's surprising. Why wouldn't more adrenaline trigger rhythm issues?
Well, the sources note that the adrenaline increase from caffeine is actually less than the increase you get from moderate exercise.
Yeah.
Of course, and this is critical at toxic doses, very high amounts, caffeine can rarely cause severe problems like dangerously low blood pressure or even life-threatening rhythms like ventricular fibrillation. But that's toxicity, not typical use.
Gotcha. But there was that surprising finding about heart health and cognition mentioned.
Yes. This was really interesting. Coffee consumption was actually correlated with better cognitive performance.
Yeah.
Specifically in patients who have atrial fibrillation or AFib.
AFib, that's an irregular heartbeat, and those patients are often worried about stroke and cognitive decline, right?
Exactly. So it seems counterintuitive. You'd think doctors might tell AFib patients to avoid stimulants.
Yeah.
But based on this finding and other literature, the sources actually conclude that clinicians should not discourage regular coffee consumption in these patients. The data, surprisingly, suggests a potential cognitive benefit in this specific group.
That's a potentially practice-changing takeaway for doctors dealing with AFib patients. What about bone health? Any connection there?
There is a link noted, yeah, although the effect seems relatively small overall. When you take caffeine acutely, maybe 150 to 300 milligrams, 1 to 3 cups of coffee, roughly, it makes you excrete more calcium in your urine for a few hours.
And you don't get used to that effect?
Doesn't seem like it.
Yeah.
Tolerance doesn't appear to develop, so it happens each time you consume caffeine in that range across different ages and genders.
Okay, so a temporary calcium loss. Does that add up to weaker bones or more fractures long term?
That's the big question. One study mentioned in these sources looked at women taking 400 milligrams a day for about 3 weeks. It found evidence that this altered markers of bone, remodeling the process of breaking down old bone and building new bone. However, in that specific, relatively short study, it didn't significantly affect how much calcium they absorbed or their total calcium excretion over the day.
So it nudges the process acutely, but the long-term impact on overall bone density at typical doses isn't definitively laid out as a major concern in these sources.
It seems less pronounced than, say, the brain or heart effects, but it's noted as something caffeine does influence, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What about pregnancy and breastfeeding? That's always a concern with substances. What do the sources say?
This is a tricky area because the research results have been somewhat conflicting. Some large population studies, epidemiological studies, have suggested a link between caffeine intake during pregnancy, sometimes even below that 300 milligram day guidelines, sometimes higher, and an increased risk of the baby having slower growth in the womb, intrauterine growth retardation, or lower birth weight.
Especially in non-smokers, you mentioned.
Yes, that association was sometimes stronger in non-smokers.
So some studies suggest potential risks for the baby's growth.
That's what some data points towards. But then, the sources also mentioned other studies that didn't find a significant link to low birth weight, although they still sometimes found that association with slower growth in the womb. So the findings aren't perfectly consistent across the board.
So with these mixed results from the data presented, what's the general takeaway offered in these specific sources?
Based on the limited data reviewed here, the conclusion drawn is that moderate intake, defined in this context as less than 300 milligrams per day by pregnant and nursing mothers, is considered unlikely to cause adverse effects on the baby's development after birth. It highlights that while there are associations and concerns raised in some studies, the evidence presented here isn't conclusive enough to say absolutely no caffeine, but it does reinforce that caution is generally advised and moderation is key. It's an area needing more research.
Okay, moderation seems like the watchword there. And finally, toxicity. Too much of anything is bad. How much caffeine is too much?
Right. The negative effects are definitely dose-dependent. A single large dose, usually cited as over 300 milligrams, can lead to caffeine intoxication.
What does that actually look like? What are the symptoms?
You might feel really restless, nervous, have trouble sleeping, get tremors or feel shaky. Your heart might race. You might feel agitated and fidgety. Maybe even have chaotic thoughts or speech patterns.
Not pleasant. Are there general guidelines for toxicity thresholds? Like how much is too much per day?
The sources mention general reference points. For healthy adults, 19 plus, the threshold where toxicity concerns increase is often cited around 400 milligrams per day. It's lower for younger people, maybe around 100 milligrams per day for adolescents, 12-18, and for children under 12, it's often given as about 2.5 milligrams per kilogram of their body weight per day.
Okay, those are useful benchmarks. 400 milligrams for adults, 100 milligrams for teens, and weight-based for younger kids. Good to keep in mind.
They provide a rough guide to where risks start to climb significantly.
So yeah, a really complex picture for the physical body too. Heart, blood vessels, bones, pregnancy, toxicity limits. All depending on dose, who you are, how often you consume it.
Very much so. The physical effects alone show just how many different systems caffeine interacts with.
Let's pull back now for a longer view. Section 6 in the outline looks at caffeine, especially coffee, and maybe protecting against cognitive decline or dementia as we age.
Yeah, this is a really interesting and potentially hopeful area of research that the sources touch upon.
What's the potential good news for our brains long term?
Well, some studies have found that higher coffee consumption is associated with slower rates of cognitive decline in older adults. It's also been linked in some research to less buildup of amyloid in the brain.
And amyloid is that sticky protein strongly linked to Alzheimer's disease, right?
That's the one. This link between more coffee and less amyloid was specifically highlighted in a source looking at older adults who were already at high risk for stroke, a group vulnerable to cognitive problems. So various population studies have hinted at this protective effect of regular coffee drinking against cognitive decline, particularly in the elderly.
Is this finding solid across the board? Does all the research agree?
Not entirely conclusively, no. While there are promising findings suggesting protection, some other studies haven't found significant links. So it's an active area, the data is suggestive and points in a positive direction for coffee, but it's not quite a slam dunk, universally proven fact just yet based on these sources.
Okay. If coffee is protective, how might it be working? What are the potential mechanisms the sources suggest?
They propose several possibilities. One is reducing oxidative stress, basically acting like an antioxidant in the brain, fighting cell damage. Another is acting as an anti-inflammatory. Chronic inflammation is increasingly linked to neurodegeneration.
Okay, antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. Makes sense.
It might also increase neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt, rewire, and form new connections. The sources also mention reducing leakage across the blood-brain barrier, that protective barrier around the brain, which can become leaky with age or disease. And finally, as we said, potentially reducing the buildup of that amyloid protein itself.
So potentially multiple lines of defense. Fighting damage, reducing inflammation, helping the brain adapt, strengthening its defenses, and clearing out problematic proteins.
That's the exciting possibility being explored, that maybe beyond the short-term kick, regular coffee consumption could be supporting the brain's resilience in several ways over the long term.
Fascinating. Now let's circle back to something really fundamental that caffeine hits directly. Sleep. Section 7, caffeine, sleep, and our daily rhythms.
Right. So caffeine's main trick, as we know, is blocking adenosine. Adenosine builds up while you're awake, creating sleep pressure, making you feel tired. Caffeine jams those adenosine receptors, reducing that sleepy feeling.
And this pushes against our natural wakefulness drive, which is run by our circadian rhythm.
Exactly. And the sources really stress something important about that circadian rhythm, your internal body clock. Things like your core body temperature cycle. They run on a pretty fixed 24-hour schedule generated from within, regardless of whether you actually sleep or stay awake.
Like an internal timer that just keeps ticking?
Precisely. The data shown in the sources illustrates this core body temp. Dips at night, rises during the day on schedule, whether you sleep or force yourself to stay up. Caffeine is basically pushing against both that underlying circadian signal for sleep and the adenosine sleep pressure building up.
It's fighting biology on two fronts.
In a way, yes. But importantly, it doesn't eliminate the need for sleep, nor does it reset the circadian clock. It just masks the feeling of tiredness for a while. And we already saw those EEG findings.
Right. Changing brain activity during sleep, increasing complexity, shifting towards criticality.
Yeah, and how withdrawal increases those drowsy theta waves during sleep. It all underlines that caffeine isn't just about preventing sleep onset. It's influencing the very structure and electrical patterns of your brain while you sleep, and affecting how rested you feel afterwards, especially if you're in withdrawal.
So it's not just keeping you up, it's subtly altering sleep itself and contributing to morning grogginess if you're dependent. A deep interaction.
Very deep. It's not just a surface effect.
Yeah. The sources also talk about using caffeine as a tool, right? Especially when you can't get enough sleep.
Yes, absolutely. For situations like unavoidable sleep deprivation, military operations, maybe shift work, emergency situations, caffeine can be a useful tool. It can temporarily restore alertness and performance when someone is seriously fatigued.
How much caffeine are we talking about in those situations?
The sources mention doses ranging from maybe 200 milligrams up to 600 milligram for individuals whose performance is severely degraded due to lack of sleep.
So it can be a kind of rescue remedy in critical moments.
It can function that way, yes. However, and the sources are incredibly clear on this, it's vital note. No drug, caffeine included, can substitute for adequate sleep.
Right. It doesn't replace sleep.
Not at all. Caffeine can help you function temporarily when sleep deprived, but it doesn't provide the actual biological restoration that sleep does. You don't get the cellular repair, the memory consolidation, the emotional processing. It just masks the fatigue. You can't cheat sleep indefinitely.
That's such a crucial point. You might feel awake, but your brain and body aren't getting what they truly need. You still build up a sleep debt.
Exactly. And the sources even detail some of sleep's critical functions. Deep non-REM sleep seems vital for strengthening individual memories, locking down facts. REM sleep, on the other hand, is described almost like a creative incubator.
Creative incubator? I like that. How so?
Well, during REM, the brain seems to be busy blending and connecting different memories and bits of information, sometimes in novel ways. It's thought to be where we extract the gist or underlying patterns from experiences. It might also help reprocess emotional memories in a safer context, as certain stress chemicals are lower during REM. It's where new connections can form, insights might bubble up, sometimes leading to those aha moments upon waking.
Fascinating. So NREM locks down the data, REM helps you understand it, connect it, be creative with it.
That's a good way to think about their complementary roles.
Yeah.
And linking this back to caffeine, remember that finding about explicit memory?
Yeah, caffeine improved it specifically during the non-optimal time, early morning, when exercise didn't show the same effect.
Right. Why is that telling? It suggests caffeine might have a unique ability to boost performance precisely when your biological clock is saying sleep and adenosine levels are high. Exercise might wake you up generally, but it didn't target that specific memory function in the same way caffeine did in that morning slump scenario.
So it has real-world relevance for morning exams, early shifts.
Exactly. It suggests caffeine can be strategically useful for counteracting those biological dips in alertness and cognitive function that happen at certain times, affecting specific processes like explicit memory recall or that response selection we talked about.
So it's not just a blunt on switch, it's more targeted against the biology of fatigue and timing.
That's a great way to put it, a targeted interaction.
Okay, finally, let's quickly run through Section 8. Where do we actually get this stuff? The sources and concentrations. Knowing where it comes from helps understand intake.
Right. Coffee is obviously huge for adults globally, but caffeine pops up in many other places the sources mention.
Like tea, another big one.
Yep, tea is very significant for adults, and the caffeine content varies a lot depending on the type of tea, how long you brew it. For kids and adolescents, soft drinks and chocolate are often bigger sources.
And the amount of caffeine per serving is all over the map.
Wildly different. The sources give a rough hierarchy, but it varies hugely. Espresso generally has the highest concentration, maybe 240 to even 720 milligrams per 8 ounces, if you drank that much espresso. Brewed coffee is typically next, maybe 100 to 200 milligrams per 8-ounce cup.
Okay.
Then things like yerba mate, around 65, 130 milligrams. Energy drinks, this is a huge range, maybe 50, 160 milligrams per standard can, but some are way higher brewed tea. 40, 120 milligrams, depending on type brew. Soft drinks, usually 20, 40 milligram. Even decaf coffee isn't zero, usually 312 milligrams. And then cocoa or chocolate milk has a little bit, maybe 27 milligrams.
That range for energy drinks is nuts, 50 to potentially over 500 milligrams.
It's massive. Some of those energy shots, or larger cans, pack a huge punch. The sources definitely highlight concerns about energy drinks. The aggressive marketing, often aimed at young people, linking them to performance.
And the potential gateway effect mentioned earlier.
Yes, several studies cited suggested a link between energy drink consumption and higher risk of using other substances later on. It's an area of concern. Plus, regulating them is tricky and varies by country or region, especially regarding added versus naturally occurring caffeine.
And we shouldn't forget caffeine in pills, medications, supplements.
Right. Lots of over-the-counter pain relievers or cold meds have caffeine added, often to boost the main ingredient or fight drowsiness. And it's very common in pre-workout supplements and other sports nutrition products.
So yeah, it's everywhere. In drinks, foods, pills. And the dose can vary tremendously, making it actually quite hard to know exactly how much you're getting unless you're really paying attention.
It really requires reading labels and being aware of that huge variability. Not always easy.
Okay, wow. We have covered a ton of ground in this deep dive, really guided by the rich sources you shared.
We really have. We've seen how caffeine tunes our alertness, how it can selectively boost memory at certain times, how it shapes mood, sometimes positively, sometimes triggering anxiety, and how it definitely leads to dependence and withdrawal, which are major factors in why people keep using it.
Yeah, and we looked under the hood at how our bodies handle it, absorption, metabolism, those active byproducts like paraxanthine that keep the effects going.
And we touched on the potential long-term links, the intriguing possibility of protection against cognitive decline, those complex effects on the cardiovascular system, the small but real impact on calcium, the mixed findings around pregnancy and the need for moderation, and the clear toxicity limits.
Plus, how it fundamentally interacts with sleep and our internal clocks, how it can be a temporary tool against fatigue, but absolutely not a substitute for real rest.
I think what really emerges from digging into all these sources is just how nuanced caffeine is. It's not simply good or bad. Its effects depend on so many things.
Right. The dose, your own biology, genetics, metabolism, the time of day, how much you usually drink, whether you're tired or in withdrawal, even where you get it from.
Exactly. Understanding the science, like we've tried to do here, helps us get past those simple labels and appreciate the really intricate dance caffeine does with our bodies and brains. It's powerful, it's pervasive, and it interacts in these complex, dose-dependent, individually variable ways.
It really does.
So, thinking about all that, caffeine's profound ability to change brain activity, mess with our daily rhythms, influence everything from alertness right now to maybe our brain health decades from now. It leads to a final thought, really, for you listening. How consciously are you actually managing your caffeine intake? And what potential might there be in thinking about it more strategically, maybe adjusting the timing, the source, maybe even cutting back sometimes? How could you use that knowledge to better align your caffeine use with your own biological needs and your goals, both for today and for your future health?
Definitely something to mull over with that next cup.